March 7th, 1945. The hills above Remagen, Germany, looked like ghosts of another century. Burnt trees, shattered farmhouses, and a river that had seen empires rise and fall. From the heights, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann lifted his binoculars, expecting to see smoke and twisted steel where a bridge once stood. Instead, what stared back at him through the mist made no military sense at all. The bridge still stood. The Ludendorff Bridge, 300 metres of iron and stone stretching across the Rhine River, was supposed to be gone. Every German officer from Cologne to Koblenz had orders to demolish every crossing before the Allies arrived. Yet there it was, defying every order, every assumption, every line of the map. The air smelled of cordite and spring thaw. Around Engelmann, his men of the 9th Armoured Division, the Phantom Division that German intelligence kept reporting destroyed, were stunned into silence. The Rhine was more than water, it was a wall. For 2,000 years it had guarded the German heartland. Caesar's legions had stopped here. Napoleon had crossed it only by flooding the river with bodies, and now, in 1945, it was supposed to be Hitler's final barrier, the line that would give the Third Reich time to breathe, to negotiate, to die on its own terms. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, just 22, stood beside his commander, his helmet streaked with mud and disbelief. "Sir," he said quietly, "we have to take it before they blow it." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed what every man felt. This might be the only unbroken bridge across the Rhine, and it could change the war in a single afternoon. Below them, the town of Remagen smouldered. The Ludendorff's twin stone towers rose like ancient fortresses, their silhouettes framed by the silver current of the river. Trucks still rolled across the bridge, German trucks, carrying soldiers, civilians, carts, chaos. Somehow, the destruction order had not been carried out. For 6 months, the Allies had been grinding their way east, across France, through the Ardennes, through the frozen forests of the Bulge. Hitler's last gamble had failed. The Battle of the Bulge had bled Germany's army white. 100,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks lost, entire veteran formations erased. Now the Americans were everywhere, 12 divisions pushing toward the Rhine, 5 times the strength of the defenders. Germany's western armies were a shadow, their once proud divisions reduced to skeleton crews and boys from the Volkssturm armed with desperation. Yet the Ludendorff Bridge remained, the last unbroken thread connecting retreat to survival. It had been built during the First World War, when German engineers still thought in centuries. Named for General Erich Ludendorff, the same man who had driven the Kaiser's armies to exhaustion, it had been constructed by Russian prisoners of war, their labour buried in the mortar. The irony was brutal. Those prisoners had built it too well. The bridge had survived bombings, floods, even Allied air raids. It was built to carry locomotives heavy enough to crush mountains, and now, in March of 1945, it stood between the Allies and the collapse of Germany. The American operation pushing toward it was called Lumberjack, a name far too modest for what was unfolding. The plan had been simple. Take Cologne and Koblenz, clear the West Bank, prepare for a methodical crossing later that month. No one expected to find an intact bridge. Aerial reconnaissance had shown the others reduced to ruins. Cologne's crossings were gone, Bonn's bridges blown into the water. The engineers assumed Remagen would be the same, but orders and reality had diverged inside the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Hitler, enraged months earlier when an air raid had prematurely destroyed the Mülheim Bridge, had forbidden demolitions without his personal authorization. His paranoia turned military engineering into theatre. Commanders were terrified. Blow a bridge too early and face execution. Wait too long and be accused of treason. The result was paralysis. The chain of command strangled itself with its own fear. By dawn on March 7th, the German high command in the Remagen sector was chaos. One corps commander had wandered into American lines and been captured. His replacement was trapped behind roadblocks. The officer nominally responsible for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, Major Hans Scheller, had been handed command overnight. He'd never even seen the bridge before. He set out with 8 men and a radio truck that broke down twice on the way. When he finally arrived exhausted, it was already nearly noon. Captain Willy Bratke, the man actually holding Remagen, had almost nothing left to defend it with. His roster claimed 600 men. In truth, fewer than 40 could fight. Many were wounded, some were teenagers, others were foreign conscripts who'd rather surrender than die for Hitler. His pleas for reinforcements had vanished into the static of a dying army. The demolition charges that were supposed to be installed were still sitting in crates in a shed nearby. As Scheller and Brack scrambled to attach explosives under artillery fire, American tanks rolled closer through the hills. The fog that had cloaked the valley all morning lifted like a curtain pulled by fate. Suddenly the bridge, the river and the town lay exposed in perfect sunlight. At 1 p.m, Engelmann's lead scouts reached the edge of the ridge. Below them the impossible sight, the Ludendorff Bridge alive with motion, German vehicles retreating across. "Sir, it's intact," one of them said over the radio. Engelmann didn't hesitate. He called his superior, Brigadier General William Hogg, commanding Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division. Hogg arrived minutes later, surveyed the scene, and made a decision that would change the course of the war. "We're taking that bridge. Right now." There was no time for reconnaissance. Every minute risked a German explosion that would erase the opportunity forever. The order went out: seize the bridge, intact if possible. The town of Remagen lay between the Americans and the bridge, a tangle of rubble and narrow streets filled with snipers and desperation. Lieutenant John Grimble's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks, brand new, gleaming monsters armed with 90mm guns, led the charge. They thundered into the town, shells smashing through walls, white phosphorus rounds turning intersections into clouds of blinding smoke. Infantry followed behind, moving house to house, clearing the last resistance. Bratch watched from the western tower, sweat freezing on his face. He gave the order to blow the approach ramp. The explosion tore a crater 3 meters deep, enough to stop tanks, but the bridge itself stayed intact. His engineers had placed the charges too hastily. The structure refused to die. By 3:20, American armour was firing from the far end of town. German anti-aircraft guns on the eastern cliffs turned downward, spitting fire at infantry now racing toward the bridge. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led the charge. 120 men from A Company, 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, sprinted onto the steel deck as bullets hissed around them. They advanced in short bursts, diving for cover behind girders and the bridge's massive arches. German machine guns in the towers raked the walkway. The sound was a single rolling scream of steel and gunfire. On the far bank, Major Scheller stood at the tunnel entrance, surrounded by smoke, panic, and the weight of a decision no man should have to make. The bridge was wired with explosives, the electric detonator ready. American troops were halfway across. His orders were clear: destroy it before it could fall into enemy hands. Yet a young lieutenant, Karl Peters, begged for more time. His anti-aircraft battery still hadn't finished moving its experimental rocket launchers across. If the bridge went now, those weapons would be lost. Scheller hesitated, torn between duty and logic. He waited 3 fatal minutes. At 4 o'clock, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer in charge of the detonator, turned the key. Nothing. The electric circuit had failed, cut somewhere by shell fire. Friesenhahn ran outside, shouting for fuses, but it was too late. Sergeant Alex Drabik of Toledo, Ohio, dashed forward, bullets snapping past his helmet, and became the first American soldier to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon. Behind him, Timmermann's men stormed across one after another. Combat engineers followed, cutting wires, tearing out explosives, hurling them into the water. German fire poured down from the cliffs, but momentum belonged to the Americans. A German engineer, Corporal Anton Faust, made one last desperate attempt. He sprinted onto the bridge under fire, lit the manual fuse, and dove for cover. The explosion threw men in every direction. The bridge rose, shuddered, then slammed back into its foundations. For a moment, no one breathed. When the dust cleared, the structure still stood, bent, smoking, but unbroken. The impossible had happened. By 4:15 p.m., American troops were fighting inside the railway tunnel on the far side. Within an hour, they had captured hundreds of dazed prisoners, including Captain Bratch himself. Scheller fled east to report what had happened, knowing already what his fate would be. On the western shore, the 9th Armoured's engineers swarmed the bridge, cutting remaining charges, shoring up beams and building ramps over the cratered approach. Tanks rumbled forward, one by one, followed by jeeps, artillery, and entire battalions. For the first time, Allied armour was crossing the Rhine. At 5 o'clock, Brigadier General Hogg radioed his superior. "We've got the bridge." Those 4 words travelled up the chain of command like electricity. Within minutes, 1st Army Commander Courtney Hodges had the news. He grabbed the phone so quickly he spilled his coffee. "You're sure it's intact?" he asked. The answer came back. "We're already across." Hodges called General Omar Bradley, who was in conference at the 12th Army Group headquarters. "Brad, we got a bridge," he said, barely containing his excitement. Bradley shot up from his chair. "You mean you've got one still standing?" "Yes, sir." At Remagen, Bradley's response became legend. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust 'em wide open. Get everything you can over it." When Dwight D. Eisenhower received the report in France, he immediately saw its meaning. His entire spring campaign plan assumed that no bridges would survive. The Allies were preparing for massive amphibious crossings in late March. Now, by accident or providence, they had a permanent bridgehead into the German heartland 3 weeks early. "This," Eisenhower said quietly to his staff, "is one of those moments that changed the course of war." In Berlin, when news reached Hitler, the reaction was volcanic. Witnesses later said he screamed for hours, his face purple, veins bulging. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's final defence, the symbol of eternal resistance. An intact bridge was an act of betrayal, an insult to destiny. He demanded executions. Within 48 hours, a flying court-martial was formed under General Rudolf Hübner, a fanatic with orders to find the guilty and kill them. While German officers faced firing squads, the Americans poured men and machines across the river. The Ludendorff Bridge groaned under the weight but held. Engineers worked through the night under spotlights, repairing holes, welding beams, directing the endless traffic. Infantry dug in on the eastern hills, expanding the bridgehead yard by yard. German command reeled. Orders contradicted each other. Air units were promised for counterattacks that never came. By the second day, the Luftwaffe had managed to assemble a handful of jet bombers and fighters, the new Mi-262s and R-234s. They screamed in at 800 kilometers an hour, dropping bombs that thundered across the valley, but their accuracy was miserable. The bridge survived every run. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the valley in blazing halos. The Americans claimed to have shot down more than 100 German aircraft in the first week. The attacks grew desperate. Frogmen swam through the icy current at night, carrying mines strapped to their chests. Searchlights caught them like ghosts, and machine gun fire ended their mission before it began. The Germans floated explosive boats, even launched V-2 rockets, 11 of them, from Holland, the first and only time those weapons were used against a tactical target. Not one struck the bridge. By March 9th, engineers had already built a secondary pontoon crossing beside the Ludendorff, just in case it fell. Trucks, tanks, and artillery rolled in a never-ending stream. Within 24 hours, 8,000 men were across. Every failed German attack deepened the psychological collapse. What had once been faith in Hitler's genius became muttered despair. Officers who had preached the invincibility of the fatherland now whispered that the war was lost. The Rhine, Germany's ancient shield, was breached. On March 14th, 4 German officers were executed in the forests near Rimbach and Ober-Essonne. Major Hans Scheller, Lieutenant Karl Peters, Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel. They had been found guilty of cowardice and dereliction. In truth, they had been victims of a system already disintegrating. Captain Bradge, who had actually commanded the bridge defence, was tried in absentia and condemned, but survived as a prisoner of war. Meanwhile, on the bridge itself, life and death continued hour by hour. Engineers reinforced the sagging arches, patched holes, and prayed the steel would last. Every tremor of artillery fire sent dust trickling from the joints. They nicknamed it the bridge that refused to die. 10 days later, on March 17th at 3 in the afternoon, its strength finally gave out. Witnesses heard the sharp crack of metal, one hanger, then another. The centre span lifted into the air, then plunged into the Rhine with a roar that drowned out every other sound. 28 American engineers died in the collapse, 60 were injured. Yet by then, it no longer mattered. 2 additional tactical bridges stood beside the ruins, and more than 25,000 troops had already crossed. The bridge that shouldn't have existed had done its job. The bridge was gone, but its purpose had been fulfilled. For 10 relentless days it had carried men, tanks and artillery into the heart of Germany. Its fall into the river was not a defeat, but a conclusion. The final act of a structure that had done more for the Allied advance than any general could have planned. The men who watched it collapse stood in silence. Some saluted, others simply turned back to their work. there was still a war to win. By the evening of March 17th, the new pontoon and treadway bridges stretched across the river like veins of steel. Floodlights burned through the night, reflecting off the black water as convoys rolled east in endless succession. Engineers who had slept barely an hour in days stood ankle-deep in mud, directing traffic with red lamps. The air trembled with the roar of engines and the distant thunder of artillery. In the shattered town of Remagen, the Americans built command posts inside cellars and churches, their radios crackling with the sound of an army in motion. Beyond the Rhine, the hills glowed with the flashes of fighting as German counterattacks tried and failed to push the invaders back into the river. The bridgehead was growing, 2 miles deep, then 5, then 10. Every yard gained widened the breach in Germany's last line of defence. The German army tried to respond, but it was no longer the Wehrmacht of legend. The units thrown against the bridgehead were an assemblage of fragments. Battalions without officers, tanks without fuel, men without hope. Hitler's orders to throw the enemy back into the Rhine were repeated like scripture, but the soldiers knew the words were hollow. The Rhine had ceased to be a barrier. It was now a grave marker for a dying Reich. At night, the sky pulsed with red light as German jets screamed over the valley. They came singly or in pairs, Me-262S, Arado bombers, beautiful, deadly, and useless. Their pilots were boys barely trained to fly, their targets guessed by instinct. The Americans on the ground would watch them streak past, drop their bombs wide, and vanish into the dark. Anti-aircraft guns answered from both banks, tracing golden arcs through the smoke. The battle over Remagen became one of the most intense anti-aircraft engagements of the entire European war. The Luftwaffe's effort to destroy the bridgehead consumed its last strength. In 10 days, more than 300 sorties were launched. Over 100 aircraft never returned. Jet bombers dived at supersonic speeds, but their accuracy was hopeless. V-2 rockets rained down from the Netherlands, 11 in total, each carrying a ton of high explosive. None hit the target. The rockets tore craters into nearby hillsides, killing soldiers and civilians alike. But the bridgehead remained untouched. The river itself became a battlefield. At night, German frogmen drifted downstream, their bodies wrapped in rubber suits, carrying mines designed to latch onto the bridge's pillars. The Americans countered with searchlights so bright they turned the water to glass. One by one, the swimmers were caught in the beams and cut down by machine gun fire. Later, their bodies washed ashore like wreckage from another world. Even Hitler's most secret weapons, radio-controlled boats packed with explosives, failed to reach their mark. They drifted off course, detonating harmlessly against the banks. Each failure carried a deeper psychological toll. Inside Germany, the news from Remagen spread faster than the censors could contain it. For years, propaganda had promised that the Rhine would stop the Allies, that its waters were impassable, its bridges already destroyed. The reality that an American army had simply crossed it shattered what little faith remained in the Nazi regime. Civilians whispered that the war was lost. Soldiers began surrendering in groups instead of fighting to the death. In Berlin, the response was madness wrapped in ceremony. The so-called flying court-martial moved from city to city like a travelling execution. Major Hans Scheller, who had tried to blow the bridge but failed through no fault of his own, was condemned to death. Lieutenant Karl Peters, who had begged for time to save his experimental rocket launchers, was executed as well. 2 more engineers, Kraft and Strobel, were shot in the back of the neck in a forest clearing. None of the trials lasted more than an hour, none involved evidence. Their deaths were meant not for justice, but for theatre, to reassure Hitler that loyalty could still be enforced by fear. Field Marshal Walter Model, the defensive mastermind of earlier campaigns, signed the orders with a hand that shook. He knew what it meant. The army had turned inward, killing its own to prove obedience. When word of the executions reached the front, even hardened officers were sickened. Some quietly removed their decorations, fearing that command itself had become a death sentence. While Berlin devoured itself, the Americans moved forward with relentless precision. By March 18th, more than 25,000 troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. Tanks from the 9th Armoured Division fanned out across the rolling hills east of the river, capturing villages that had never seen an American before. The 99th Infantry joined them, followed by artillery units setting up batteries that could reach 20 miles inland. The bridgehead now stretched 8 miles deep and 20 wide. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the news reports turned disbelief into opportunity. Originally, the Allied command had planned for a massive, carefully choreographed crossing under British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later that month. It would have involved paratroopers, smoke screens, artillery barrages, the works. But Remagen changed everything. Now the Americans already had their foot on the far bank, and the enemy was in disarray. Eisenhower's order was immediate and simple: exploit it. What followed was one of the fastest and most decisive advances of the entire war. By March 25th, the bridgehead erupted into full breakout. Armoured columns roared eastward at unprecedented speed, covering distances that once required weeks in mere days. Some units advanced over 100 kilometres in a single push. The 9th Armoured, the same division that had first seized the bridge, became a legend. They broke through German lines so fast that headquarters lost track of them for hours at a time. The German Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Model, tried to form a defensive line but collapsed under the weight of the movement. Communications failed, and maps became meaningless, and entire divisions vanished. By the end of March, the once mighty Army Group B, 300,000 strong, had been reduced to chaos. It would soon be encircled in the Ruhr pocket, the industrial heart of Germany, and annihilated. Model understood what that meant. The Ruhr was the engine of the Reich, the source of its coal, its steel, its lifeblood. Without it, the war was not merely lost, it was impossible to continue. Later, captured German staff officers would say that the fall of the bridge at Remagen had triggered this chain of collapse. It had not simply opened a crossing, it had ripped out the structural beam of Germany's entire defence. For the soldiers on the ground, though, the consequences were measured in mud, exhaustion, and death. The fighting east of the Rhine was fierce and often personal. German machine guns cut down advancing Americans from hidden farmhouses and vineyards. Artillery shells burst in the treetops, raining splinters of wood and iron. The men who had crossed that bridge found themselves in battles that were both chaotic and strangely empty, resistance flaring and dying within hours. For every German who fought, 10 surrendered. Still, there was no joy in it. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, who had led the first assault across the Ludendorff, was hospitalised a few days later, his body worn out by exhaustion and infection. Sergeant Alex Drabik, the first man to reach the far side, would live to see the war end, but he never forgot the noise, the weight, or the bridge that had seemed to breathe beneath his boots. In Washington, the news electrified the public. When reports of the crossing reached Congress, senators rose to their feet and applauded, breaking the chamber's rule of silence. Newspapers printed photographs of soldiers marching across the bridge, helmets glinting, rifles slung, the Rhine flowing beneath their feet. For a country that had been at war for more than 3 years, it was a symbol. The end was visible, victory tangible. In Germany, the same image appeared in underground papers with captions like, "The Rhine has fallen." Civilians packed their belongings and fled east, but there was nowhere left to go. Allied bombers filled the skies by day, Soviet armies approached from the east by night. The world was closing in. By March 31st, just 3 weeks after the first Americans had crossed at Remagen, all 4 Allied armies on the Western Front were across the Rhine. The line that had stood for millennia as Germany's natural fortress had been breached everywhere. The war that planners had expected to last into summer now looked like it could end in weeks. Eisenhower wrote later that he realised at that moment that Germany's defeat was not merely certain, but imminent. "We were across the Rhine," he recalled, "and the road to the heart of Germany lay open." For the men who had made that possible, there were medals but little rest. The 9th Armoured Division received a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the few ever awarded to an entire division. Brigadier General Hugger was promoted, his name forever linked with the bridge he had seized on instinct. Lieutenant Timmermann received the Distinguished Service Cross. Sergeant Drabik received one as well. Many of their comrades received Bronze Stars and Silver Stars, though none of those decorations could capture what they had done. They had changed the tempo of a world war by acting in minutes, when hesitation could have cost months. Historians would later argue about how much the bridge shortened the war. Some said weeks, others months. But all agreed it had been a decisive moment. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, one of the engineers on the scene, estimated that Remagen saved the Allies nearly 2 months of fighting and as many as 35,000 casualties. That calculation was crude, but not far off. Every day the war ended sooner meant thousands of soldiers and civilians who lived to see peace. Yet for all the triumph, Remagen also left scars. 28 engineers had died when the bridge finally fell, most of them men who had spent the previous week trying to keep it alive. Hundreds more were wounded during the battle to seize and hold it. Their names would never be famous, but without them, history might have taken a slower, darker course. And for the Germans, the tragedy ran deeper still. Major Scheller, who had arrived too late to make a difference, Lieutenant Peters, who had tried to follow orders, Majors Kraft and Strobel, who had done their jobs as engineers, none of them lived to see the war's end. They died not for failure, but because the regime they served could no longer tell the difference between defeat and disobedience. After the war, the officer who commanded their executions, General Rudolf Hübner, was himself tried and imprisoned for 4 years. His sentence was light, but his name would forever be linked with the madness of those final months. The bridge's ruins were cleared after the war, but its towers were left standing, 2 on each side of the river, weathered stone watching over the current. The western pair became a museum dedicated to peace, the Friedensmuseum. The eastern towers became an art space, where once machine guns had fired, now there were paintings, music and light. The symbolism was deliberate. The bridge that had seen so much death would now bear only memory. 80 years later, visitors still walk through the tunnels where the charges once lay, reading the names of the men who fought there. On both sides of the river, German and American flags fly side by side. The story of Remagen is no longer about conquest or revenge, but about courage and the razor-thin line between chance and history. Historians often say that wars are decided by logistics, by numbers, by machines. But sometimes they turn on hesitation, the moment one man waits 3 minutes too long or another chooses to act 3 minutes too soon. The Ludendorff Bridge was a product of engineering, but its fate was determined by human choices. A commander's hesitation, a sergeant's sprint, a general's instinct. Those moments collided on March 7th, 1945, and the course of Europe shifted. The Rhine had once been Germany's guardian. In that single afternoon it became the Allies' highway. The Rhine no longer marked a frontier, it marked the beginning of the end. In the weeks after the crossing at Remagen, the German army dissolved faster than even its enemies believed possible. Entire units vanished overnight. Rail lines were cut, fuel depots destroyed, and the once meticulous Wehrmacht began to move like a drowning man, thrashing without direction, pulled down by the weight of its own past. The Americans advanced in waves, columns of Shermans and half-tracks sweeping across the plains toward the heart of Germany. Behind them came the engineers and supply convoys, building roads, bridges, pipelines, turning conquest into infrastructure. The war machine that had stormed Normandy less than a year earlier now rolled through the Rhine Valley as if through an open gate. The German people watched from shattered doorways as the convoys passed. Some saluted out of habit, some wept, others simply stared. In towns untouched by battle, church bells rang for the first time in months, signalling not victory but survival. Propaganda had promised annihilation if the Allies crossed the Rhine. Instead, the soldiers handed out chocolate and cigarettes. The myth of the invincible Reich dissolved in the smoke of its own cities. For the American troops who had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge, the fighting continued, but the rhythm had changed. No longer a desperate struggle for every inch of ground, it became a relentless pursuit. Units that once crept forward yard by yard were now racing down autobahns, cutting off German divisions before they could retreat. Prisoners came by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. Many marched with white rags tied to their rifles, faces hollow, eyes searching for someone to surrender to. By early April, the Allies had encircled the Ruhr industrial region, trapping what remained of Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, more than 300,000 men. It was the same commander who had signed the death orders for the officers at Remagen. Now, surrounded, he refused to surrender. He walked into a forest near the town of Duisburg, pulled out his pistol, and ended his life beneath the trees. The Reich's fireman, the man Hitler had trusted to save collapsing fronts, had become one more casualty of loyalty to a lost cause. The capture of the Ruhr sealed Germany's fate. Without coal or steel, the factories went silent. Without oil, the tanks stopped. Without soldiers willing to fight, the front lines became paper. The Soviet Red Army was already on the Oder River, 70 kilometers from Berlin. Eisenhower's forces pushing from the west were across every major crossing of the Rhine. The two armies were now racing toward each other, closing the jaws of history. Yet among the men who had first crossed at Remagen, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. They had seen the inside of Germany, the bombed villages, the starving civilians, the prisoners freed from camps whose names the world would soon know: Buchenwald, Dachau, Ohrdruf. They realized the war was not ending with parades but with revelation, with the uncovering of crimes that words could not contain. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet troops met on the Elbe River at Torgau. Cameras recorded the handshake that divided Germany in half. For the men who had crossed the Rhine 6 weeks earlier, it felt inevitable. The road from Remagen had led directly here. The bridges they had built were now bridges between worlds, the old Europe dying, the new one just beginning to breathe. 2 weeks later, Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent after nearly 6 years of global war. In retrospect, historians would trace a straight line from that March afternoon at Remagen to the final surrender. The crossing of the Rhine had not ended the war by itself, but it had torn away its last illusion. It proved that the fortress of Europe was a myth, that even the most disciplined army could crumble when its faith collapsed. It showed that victory was not only about numbers or machines, but about nerve, the willingness to act before certainty, to seize the moment when hesitation ruled the other side. In the months that followed, the Ludendorff Bridge disappeared from headlines, but not from memory. The soldiers who had crossed it went home, some to ticker-tape parades, others to quiet towns that could never understand what they had seen. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, the young officer who led the charge, returned to Ohio and tried to start over. He rarely spoke of the bridge, but friends said he still dreamed of it. The clang of boots on steel, the roar of the river below. He died young, only 37, from a heart ailment doctors said was unrelated to the war. Others suspected otherwise. Sergeant Alex Drabik lived into the 1990s, a quiet man who ran a bar and told stories only when asked. "I was just doing my job," he would say when people asked about being the first man across. But every time he told it, his eyes drifted away, as if the bridge still stood somewhere behind them, waiting. For the Germans who survived, the legacy was darker. Captain Willy Bratsch, captured during the battle, spent months in an American camp before being released. He returned to a country divided and rebuilding, haunted by the faces of the men who had died under his command. He lived long enough to see the towers of the bridge turned into a museum. When asked what he felt looking at them, he replied, "Relief that it's still here, and sorrow that it ever had to be used." The two stone towers that framed the western end of the Ludendorff Bridge still stand today, blackened by time and weather. They rise above the Rhine like watchful sentinels, their windows empty but their silence eloquent. Inside, exhibits tell the story of the bridge's construction, its capture and its fall. Photographs of soldiers, fragments of steel, letters home, each artifact a thread in the fabric of that single day. The museum's name is simple, the Peace Museum. Its message is simpler still, that the structures built for war can, in time, become monuments to its opposite. Visitors who walk along the riverbank often pause where the bridge once connected the shores. The current moves fast here, deep and cold, but calm on the surface. Sometimes the wind carries the faint echo of machinery. Perhaps the imagination, perhaps the memory of history itself replaying the sound of tanks and boots over the steel deck. Locals say that on certain mornings, when the fog rolls in thick and low, you can almost see the outline of the bridge reappearing across the mist as if the river remembers. The story of Remagen endures because it sits at the crossroads of chance and intention. It is a reminder that wars are decided not only in grand strategies and conference rooms, but in fleeting moments. One officer's hesitation, another's impulsive courage, a malfunctioning detonator, a change in the weather. The bridge should have been destroyed. It was not, and because it stood, millions of lives were spared the prolongation of a war already lost. The events also forced the world to confront the limits of obedience. The German officers executed after Remagen were not traitors. They were soldiers trapped between impossible orders and reality. Their deaths were a final demonstration of a regime devouring itself, where failure was indistinguishable from betrayal. Their names are less known than those of the men who crossed the bridge, but they belong to the same story, the tragedy and the irony that, in war, courage sometimes takes the form of defiance, and sometimes the form of acceptance. As the years passed, the legend of the bridge grew. Books, films, and documentaries retold the story. The storming of the steel, the scramble to cut the wires, the roar when it fell. Each version added its own layer of drama, but the essence remained unchanged. The moment the tide of the Second World War turned irreversibly. For military historians, it was a study in initiative. For ordinary people, it was proof that history can pivot on seconds. By the time of the war's 80th anniversary, ceremonies on both sides of the Rhine honoured the soldiers who had fought there. American veterans, now frail and few, stood beside German officials in the shadow of the towers. Flags from both nations fluttered together in the wind. Wreaths were laid not for victory or defeat, but for the courage shared by men on both sides who faced choices no one should have to make. The mayor of Remagen, speaking at the ceremony, said something that captured the spirit of the place. This bridge belonged to no one in the end. It belonged to history. It belonged to the moment when destruction stopped making sense. Even today, military academies study Remagen as a case of spontaneous opportunity, the rare instance when lower-level initiative outran planning and changed the strategic picture. It proved that wars, however vast, still depend on the instincts of individuals. A lieutenant sees an opening, a general says yes instead of maybe. A bridge stands for 10 minutes longer than expected. Those minutes become history. The mathematics of Remagen were brutal but undeniable. Had the bridge fallen when ordered, the Allies would have been forced to conduct costly river crossings elsewhere, delaying their advance by weeks and costing tens of thousands of lives. Instead, the quick seizure of that single structure accelerated the Allied timetable by nearly 2 months. It broke the psychological spine of German resistance. It hastened the liberation of concentration camps. It shortened the suffering of millions. The numbers are cold, but the consequences were not. For the German soldiers who fought to defend the bridge, the realization of futility came slowly, then all at once. Some had believed the propaganda to the end, convinced that new wonder weapons would turn the tide. Others simply wanted to survive. When the Americans finally captured them, many expressed relief. They were tired of killing and dying for promises that had turned to dust. In interviews after the war, one captured lieutenant said, "When we saw the Americans cross the Rhine, we knew it was over. The river had always protected us. Once they crossed, even the gods had left Germany." Today, the word Remagen carries a weight beyond its geography. It stands for the collapse of certainty, for the idea that no defence, physical or ideological, is absolute. It is a lesson in how systems fail from within, how fear paralyzes command, how hesitation can be fatal. But it is also a testament to adaptability, to the soldiers who, seeing an opportunity, acted with speed, daring, and discipline. The Rhine continues to flow as it always has, indifferent to the tragedies played out on its banks. Barges glide over the same waters where once floated the wreckage of war. Children ride bicycles along the promenades that were once lined with barbed wire. The river has outlasted every empire built along it, every army that claimed it as a frontier. Yet beneath its surface lies the echo of that day in 1945, when human will and chance collided and the course of history shifted forever. The men who captured the Ludendorff Bridge did not see themselves as heroes. They were soldiers carrying out orders in a war that had consumed the world. But through their actions they demonstrated something larger, that even amid destruction, the instinct to move forward, to build, to cross, defines humanity more than the instinct to destroy. When the narrator's voice fades and the final image of the Rhine appears on screen, silent, gleaming under the evening sun, the viewer understands that the story of Remagen is not only about war, it is about bridges in every sense, between nations, between past and future, between those who fought and those who remember. The Ludendorff Bridge was built by prisoners, defended by the desperate, captured by the determined, and remembered by generations who never saw it standing. Its steel has vanished, but its shadow remains, etched in the flow of the river, in the lessons of history, in the quiet truth that sometimes the strongest structures are not made of metal, but of resolve. And so, as the Rhine continues its endless journey from the Alps to the North Sea, it carries with it the memory of that March afternoon, the smoke, the shouts, the echo of gunfire fading into the wind. The bridge that should have fallen stood long enough to change the world, and in that fragile defiance lies the heart of Remagen's story.